Snow fell heavy that winter, thicker than in years past, blanketing the mountain valley in a silence that seemed older than time itself. The cabin sat lonesome at the edge of the woods, its logs darkened by age and weather, its lanterns glowing faint against the biting wind. Inside lived the widow, a woman whose face carried both softness and sorrow. Her life turned quiet after the man of the house had gone. She managed as best as she could, feeding the fire, mending what needed mending, and praying the winter would not swallow her whole. Yet no prayer seemed strong enough to ease the weight of loneliness pressing against those wooden walls. Out of the drifting storm came a figure, towering and strange, like something carved out of the land itself. He was old, older than most men who still walked upright. But his body was built with the strength of stone, and his hair, long and white, whipped around him like a banner of snow. The people of the valley knew stories about giants, men born before the new towns came, men who had walked with tribes and rivers before fences divided the land. Some whispered this giant had Apache blood in him, that he had fought battles long ago when the land was not yet tamed, and that he wandered now with no people left to call his own. He had not knocked when he first came to the widow's steps. He had fallen to his knees there, his massive hands gripping the snow for balance, his breath thick in the icy air. His voice carried a mix of power and desperation when he spoke, telling her he wanted to stay, that he would work the land, chop the wood, haul water from the frozen creek. He promised she would not have to face the nights alone anymore. Then came the words that struck like a thunderclap through the still winter air. "Let me stay and work for you. I'll even give you children again." The weight of that vow, spoken by a giant who had seen many winters, hung heavy between them. Caught in the frost and silence, the widow's eyes, dark and cautious, searched his face for truth. She had buried her husband not long ago, the soil over his grave still fresh beneath the snow. The ache of that loss had been sharp, but sharper still was the fear of being left without protection in a land that gave no mercy to the weak. Coyotes roamed the hills, hunger stalked the woods, and men who passed by sometimes carried eyes that lingered too long on a woman alone. She had prayed for help, but never in her imagining did she think it would come kneeling at her porch in the shape of a weathered giant. His hands trembled not from weakness, but from the raw force of something he could not fully hide: longing, hunger, maybe even redemption. She could see scars across his chest and arms, some old, some new. The kind a man earns not from cowardice, but from surviving battles that should have killed him. His hair, silver as the moonlight, framed a face both fierce and worn. He looked at her not like a passing stranger, but like a man staring at the last chance he had to belong anywhere again. The storm howled louder, pressing snow against the cabin's frame, rattling the shutters. She thought of turning him away, of shutting the door and leaving him to the wild. But something about the way he bent himself low, a man so strong made humble in the cold, stirred a hidden corner of her heart. She did not answer him right away. Instead, she wrapped her shawl tighter, glanced at the fire burning inside, then back at the giant kneeling outside as though he belonged to another world. The valley had not seen peace for long. Not with the war years still close enough to remember, not with men still fighting over land, not with hunger always at the door. To take him in would mean taking in all his burdens too. His kind carried stories of battles with soldiers, raids in the night, and trails that ended in sorrow. The townsfolk would whisper if they saw him at her side, call her desperate, call her mad. Yet deep down, she knew whispers would not keep her warm at night. Nor would they guard her door when winter wolves prowled close. Her hand, pale and thin against the winter air, reached slowly toward him, though she stopped before their fingers met. She had questions she had not spoken yet, why he had chosen her cabin, what shadows followed behind him, whether he was offering more than his strength. His eyes, dark as the earth beneath the snow, held hers steady, and in that gaze she felt the weight of a man who had lived through more than one lifetime of loss. He seemed ready to give whatever he had left, even if it was little more than worn-down bones and a heart heavy with old grief. The lantern by the door flickered, its light catching on his breath as it spilled into the night air. He was still kneeling, snow gathering on his shoulders, his words waiting in the cold between them. She could hear the storm clawing at the roof, but his silence carried a storm of its own. She knew if she spoke the wrong word, he might rise and vanish back into the wilderness, leaving her to wonder if she had turned away the only soul who had come when she needed one most. Her lips parted as if to answer, but no sound came. The fire crackled behind her, urging her to decide, to take him in or send him away. He lowered his head slightly, as though bracing for rejection. And the sight of such a mighty figure humbled by need carved a strange ache in her chest. And there, in that fragile moment, with the snow falling thicker, the giant Apache waited, his vow still lingering in the frozen air. While the widow stood at the edge of Choiscott, between the memory of a love lost and the unsettling promise of something fierce, unknown and alive standing before her, the night held its breath. Waiting for her answer, the widow's breath clouded in the cold as she stood frozen in the doorway, her hand trembling at her side. The storm outside raged louder, swirling white across the valley, but all she could hear was the thudding of her own heart. The giant's words repeated in her mind, heavy and raw. He wanted to stay, to work, to guard, to build. Yet behind his offer lingered something she couldn't quite name, something caught between desperation and fate. She had always thought of herself as sensible, a woman who kept her world ordered even when grief tried to split it apart. But nothing about this night felt orderly. It felt as though the world had tipped into a strange new place where the laws of reason no longer ruled. Her eyes lingered on the man kneeling in the snow. His shoulders were broad, his frame carved from years of work and struggle. His skin was weathered, marked by the sun, wind, and scars of battles long ago. He looked like a figure pulled from an old tale whispered by firesides, a man out of step with time, belonging more to the earth than to the settlements that had crept across it. She wondered what hunger had driven him here. Hunger for food, for shelter, for work, or for something deeper. There was a hollow in his gaze, as though he carried ghosts that refused to leave him, and she shivered. Not only from the cold, but from the weight of what might come if she let him in. He lifted his eyes slowly, studying her as though her answer mattered more than his next breath. For a moment she thought of her husband. She could still see him standing in this very doorway, his laughter carrying across the yard, his voice steady and sure when storms rolled in. His death had not been heroic or poetic, only swift and cruel, leaving her alone with a cabin, a patch of land, and the sharp bite of silence. She had grown used to that silence, though it pressed against her like a stone she could never set down. But now the silence was broken, and the one who broke it was no ordinary man. He was a giant, a stranger, a living reminder of a world her husband used to speak of but never fully explained. At last, she motioned him inside. Not a word passed her lips, only a small gesture, but the way his body shifted told her he understood. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, as though wary of frightening her with his size. When he stepped into the cabin, the space seemed to shrink. His presence filled it, pressing against the low ceiling and narrow walls, yet he moved carefully, almost reverently. Snow melted from his hair and shoulders, dripping onto the wooden floor. He did not sit until she nodded toward the bench near the fire. When he lowered himself onto it, the bench groaned under his weight. But it held. The widow busied herself with the kettle, though her hand shook as she poured water. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and herbs, a faint comfort against the storm outside. She kept her back turned for longer than needed, listening to the sound of his breathing. It was steady, but deep, like the rumble of distant thunder. She wondered if he noticed how tightly she clutched her shawl, how carefully she avoided his eyes. When she finally turned, his gaze met hers again, and she felt pinned in place, as though he could see past her small defenses into the core of her sorrow. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. He told her he had wandered long, that he had no tribe left, no home, no family to claim him. He spoke of deserts where the ground cracked beneath the sun, of rivers that once ran wide but now lay dry, of battles fought not only with soldiers but with hunger, sickness, and time itself. His words painted a picture of a man carved out of survival, of a people broken but not forgotten. He said he carried those memories with him, heavy as stones in his chest. He said he had been searching for a place to set them down, a place where his hands could work and his heart could rest. And then he looked at her, not with the eyes of a beggar, but with the weight of someone making his last plea. She listened, her hands folded tight in her lap, her mind racing faster than her tongue could form questions. Was he telling her the truth? Or was it a story crafted to win her pity? She thought of the danger of letting a stranger in, of the whispers that would follow if word spread through the valley. Yet she could not deny the pull of his presence, nor the strange comfort in knowing she was not alone in this storm. Her loneliness had carved out a hollow place inside her, and now, sitting across from her fire, was a man who carried hollows of his own, the kettle hissed. And she poured him a cup, sliding it across the table. His hands, massive and scarred, closed around it with surprising gentleness. He bowed his head slightly, as if the simple act of being given warmth was something sacred. For a moment, the silence between them was softer, less sharp. She found herself studying the lines of his face, the silver in his hair, the depth of his eyes. He seemed older than she first thought, though his strength had not yet abandoned him. There was a dignity about him, a kind of old-world weight that made him seem both dangerous and necessary. Outside, the storm did not let up. The wind pressed against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters and whistling through the cracks. The valley lay buried in snow, and she knew no one would be passing through for days. She was alone with him, for better or worse. That thought should have frightened her more than it did, but instead, it set her heart pounding with a strange, restless energy she could not name. She kept thinking of the words he had spoken at her doorstep, the vow that had hung in the air between them. He had not spoken it again, but it lingered still, heavier than the snow piling outside. As the fire burned lower, he began to speak once more, sharing pieces of his past in fragments. He spoke of a time when he was young, when he had been part of something larger than himself. He described nights by great fires, voices singing to the stars, hunts across wild plains, the pride of a people who walked tall and free. His tone shifted when he spoke of the changes that came, of land taken, families scattered, promises broken. He did not raise his voice or curse, but the pain in his words was enough to stir the air in the room. She sat quietly, her fingers gripping her shawl tighter, imagining the world he spoke of, a world that seemed far away, yet close enough to feel in his presence. The more he spoke, the more she saw him not just as a stranger, but as a man carved by history's cruelty. His size, his strength, his scars, all of it seemed less like something to fear and more like proof of survival. And yet that survival came with shadows. She wondered what violence his hands had known, what choices he had made to keep living when so many others had not. She wondered if taking him in would mean inviting those shadows into her home, into her life. The fire cracked, sending sparks into the dim room. His eyes followed the flames, but she noticed his hand flex against the cup, as though holding back words he had not yet dared to speak. The silence stretched heavier than before, until at last he lifted his gaze to hers. The question in his eyes was the same as before, unspoken but burning. Would she let him stay? Would she give him the chance to work, to guard, to belong? Her chest tightened under the weight of it, torn between caution and the aching need for anything that would break the endless winter of her heart. She wanted to ask him what he expected of her, what it would mean if she let him remain, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she looked toward the window where the storm pressed white against the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its cry carried on the wind, haunting and sharp. The sound made her shiver, reminding her of the dangers that lurked beyond the firelight. She turned back to him, and though she said nothing, he seemed to understand the question hanging between them. His chest rose slowly, his breath deep, and for a moment it seemed he might speak again. But then he only leaned forward slightly, his massive hands resting on his knees, his eyes locked on hers. The firelight flickered across his face, carving shadows that made him seem both ancient and unyielding. And in that quiet, the widow felt the air shift once more, heavy with choice, heavy with the promise of something that could not yet be named. The night stretched long, the storm unbroken, and the answer still hung suspended between them. By morning, the storm had laid a white hush across the valley. The giant had risen before the first gray light and stepped out to split wood. The widow watched from the doorway, blanket tight around her shoulders, as his arms rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Every crack of the axe rang through the cold like a bell. He moved with a patience that felt older than the hills, stacking each piece of firewood in even rows beside the cabin wall. The work warmed him, steam lifting from his hair in the frozen air. She found herself breathing easier at the simple sound of labor, yet the unease inside her did not lift. It had only changed shape. When he came in, he set down the axe without a sound, careful of her neat floor, as if the place belonged to him already, and yet he dared not believe it. He ate the porridge she served with a quiet gratitude that seemed to fill the room more than words. Afterward, he asked about the well, the fence line, the smokehouse, the tool shed, the creek road. His questions were the questions of a man planning to stay. She answered in short pieces, and the map of their shared day took form between them. They moved through chores together. He hauled water, patched a loose shutter, tightened the hinge on the pantry door. She worked beside him, sweeping, checking the jars, feeding the fire. Now and then, his nearness made the air feel crowded. Yet each time she turned, she found his eyes lowered, humbler than his size would suggest. He did not try to touch her. He kept a respectful space, as if he understood that the choice she had not spoken was still being weighed. Midday brought clear sky and the hard shine of sun on snow. They walked to the barn, where the ox stood stamping in the straw. The animal had grown lean since the last harvest. The giant ran a palm along its neck and spoke low, a sound closer to a hum than a word. The beast settled. It was a small thing, but the widow felt something shift. A man who could quiet a hungry ox might quiet other troubles too. Still, the main worry hung like frost over a well, the valley's eyes. Someone would see that smoke and wonder about the stranger. By afternoon, a trail, cut clean through the snow to the woodpile, and another to the well. The giant bent under a yoke stacked with pails, moving like a mountain set to walking. When they paused for rest, he told her about a winter long ago in a canyon far to the south, where the cold came down like iron. He told it plain, the way one passes water to another without spilling. In his telling, she met an old woman who taught him how to read the sky, a boy who could track in snow as if the earth still breathed. He did not use the word Apache, but the valley had given him that name, and she heard it in the wind between each sentence. She asked one question: were they still alive? He shook his head and said nothing more. Near dusk, the first sign of trouble showed itself. A line of crows drifted above the tree line, circling the creek road, then banking low and vanishing into the bend, where the tracks narrowed between two stands of fir. The giant's eyes followed them. He reached for the coat she had set by the door and took up the long-handled knife he kept wrapped in cloth. She tensed. Then he only tucked it into his belt, as one might carry a tool. He told her he would check the bend and be back before the kettle boiled. She wanted to argue, yet the look of him against the last of the light told her the land might listen to him in a way it no longer listened to. The bend held a story. He found fresh hoof marks and the drag of a sledge through shallow snow. It's not hers, not the neighbor's. On the bank he found a loop of rope cut through at the knot, and beside it, the ashes of a small fire half hidden by new drift. He crouched and pressed 2 fingers into the imprint of a boot. Newer than the storm? 3 men, maybe 4? Not travelers. He learned what he could and slipped back to the homestead before the blue darkened to black. When he told the widow, something in her face hardened. She broke the news he had not asked for. Her husband had taken a loan the spring before he died. He meant to buy seed and a second ox, meant to bring help in for the harvest, meant to pay it off easy. Then a fever came through the valley and left the cabin quiet. The loan did not die with him. A company man had ridden out twice in the fall asking for payment or land. She had sold what she could, sent dried meat to neighbors in trade, prayed the winter would keep the riders away for one more season. The giant said little, but his jaw tightened. Old stories of land, papers, and men with tidy hats had carved deep lines into his life. He knew what it meant when a company set eyes on a valley. That night brought fresh wind. The cabin creaked, and the lantern by the door trembled. The widow lay awake listening for hoofbeats. At some hour before dawn, the giant rose and stood by the window, staring toward the bend. She could not see his face, only the broad outline, and the long white hair falling across his back. He looked like a cliff against the glass, like an old pine that refused to fall. She wondered what law he carried in his heart. Not the paper kind. The kind born of living long in a country that tries to forget your people. The days that followed wove the main conflict into every chore. Tracks came and went along the creek road, sometimes hidden, sometimes bold. Once the giant found a snare set for the ox and quietly took it down, coil by coil, before burning it in the stove. Another time, he saw a glint in the snow near the far fence. A spent casing. Men from town, drifters, rustlers looking to take shelter, and whatever else they could lift. The widow's breath shortened when he showed it to her. The past she had tried to bury was rising like the creek after thaw. The subplots grew like small fires at the edge of a forest. The first was the boy from the next ridge. Orphaned last summer, living with a trapper who spent more time in town than in the hills. The boy appeared one noon, carrying rabbit skins and a face too thin for winter. He had heard a rumor in town about a giant at the widow's cabin, an Indian ghost made flesh, a threat to decent folk. He had come to sell pelts and find out if the story had any truth. The widow gave him stew and bread by the fire while the giant repaired the latch on the door. The boy kept stealing glances, half frightened, half awed. Before leaving, he whispered that 2 riders had asked around the mercantile about land deeds and unpaid notes. He told them he knew nothing. On his way out, he paused beside the giant and raised his chin. The giant gave him a nod that seemed to place a stone in the boy's spine. That small vow between them set a seed neither of them yet understood. The second thread came from the churchwoman in town, who sometimes visited with a sack of flour and firm opinions. She arrived in a sleigh when the road thawed just enough to pass, her eyes narrow with worry and curiosity. She saw the wood neatly stacked, the fence tightened, the yard swept. She saw the stranger, tall as a doorframe, standing still beside the barn with snow sparkling along his hair. The visit grew tense quick. She spoke of safety, reputation, the watchful eyes of the sheriff, the company, the railroad men, and the restless winter. The widow thanked her for the flour and said she was safe. The churchwoman left, but not before casting a look heavy with warning. She would talk. That talk would travel fast. The third subplot rose from the land itself. A hungry wolf pack began running the ridge, driven down from higher country by deep snow. At night their calls stitched the dark from hill to hill. The giant set snares not to kill, but to warn, thin bells on wire that sang if disturbed. Twice the bells rang near midnight, and he moved like a shadow across the yard, returning at dawn with prints traced in ash. He told the widow it was not wolves both times. Men in heavy coats, looking, measuring, counting. The homestead had become a mark on someone's ledger. In the midst of this, the giant and widow built a quiet rhythm that made the conflict sharper because it showed what might be lost. He taught her to read prints more closely, to judge weight and intent from a heel mark, to feel a trail with the palm, not only the eyes. She taught him the order of the pantry, the seasons of the garden, the old rules her husband kept for irrigation and field stones. They spoke in short lines, sometimes with a shared glance that carried more meaning than a page of talk. He repaired the sleigh runner and the stovepipe cap. She mended his shirt and stitched a small pouch for the knife so its edge wouldn't catch. They were not lovers. They were 2 survivors learning the narrow art of trust while the world outside pressed hard. Word of the giant reached the sheriff. He rode out with a deputy, boots squeaking on the snow crust, hats pulled low. The sheriff had the careful smile of a man who weighed every second of silence. He asked the stranger his business on the property. The giant said he worked for food and a dry place to sleep. The sheriff looked past him to the widow, asking with his eyes whether this was her wish. She held his gaze and said yes. The deputy found the loop of rope in the ash by the fence where the giant had burned the snare, and asked questions the widow did not care to answer. The sheriff finally tipped his hat and said there were claims on the land, and the company had a right to collect. He advised that tentsmen sometimes visited country homes at night. Then he left, leaving tracks that felt like a promise and a threat all at once. After that visit, the giant told the widow more of his past because he sensed the storm shifting. He had been taken once by soldiers years ago, pressed into work on a road crew that cut a line through his people's hunting grounds. He escaped and hid in the hill country until spring, then walked north until his feet bled. He had carried a woman and her child across a river swollen with meltwater after a raid burned their camp. The child did not live long. He spoke of the child without tears, as if the grief had dried to salt and become part of him. He had learned that when the paper people set down lines on maps, the old trails vanished from their eyes, and those who still walked them were made strangers. He swore in a flat voice that he would not be taken again. The widow heard something in that vow that matched her own quiet defiance. The company riders came at last, not to strike, only to circle. 2, the first day, 3 the next, always keeping to the road. Looking with hard eyes at the cabin and the neat stack of wood and the smoke rising level to the ridge, they nodded to the widow when she stood outside with her broom. They did not nod to the giant. He stood like a post, not threatening, not meek. The riders spoke with the sheriff. They spoke with the churchwoman. They waited. One evening near sundown, the boy from the next ridge ran to the cabin with his cap frozen to his hair and fear in his breath. He said a company man had brought a new paper to the town board. Something about a winter clause in forfeiture if payment could not be made by the thaw. He heard talk that the company men had hired a pair of brothers to persuade holdouts to sell cheap. The boy's voice cracked when he said the brothers liked to start fires. The widow's face went pale. The giant thanked the boy with food for his pack and an old pair of socks from the trunk. When the boy left, the giant turned to the widow and asked for the deed. She fetched the worn envelope from a tin on the mantel. Together they studied the faded ink that carried her husband's name and the boundary lines that gave shape to her world. The giant sat long with that paper, searching it the way he might study the sky before a storm. The next morning he climbed the ridge alone. He did not say where he was going, only that he would be back by night. He left tracks deep and steady, and the widow stood watching until the firs swallowed him. Hours later he reached an old lookout where rock teeth bit through the snow. From there the whole valley spread below like a map. He marked the bend where the riders paused, the tracks to the far fence. The hidden ravine that cut behind the barn and came up beside the smokehouse. He looked for places a fire could catch and run, places a man could kneel unseen with a rifle, places a woman might flee if she were forced. He found a stand of young aspens and cut them into poles, then dragged them to the ravine and laid them across the gap to make a hidden bridge. He worked until his hands bled, singing low to steady the breath in his chest. When he started back, the sky was bruising and the cold sucked at his knuckles. The widow had been busy too. She cleared the path to the well again and set a kettle near the door with a thick cloth for carrying hot water. She moved the small chest with the deed and her husband's papers from the mantel to a hiding place under a loose floorboard near the stove. She filled sacks with flour, salt, and dried apples and tucked them in a niche behind the woodpile. Her hands shook, but the work steadied her. With each small act, she felt less like a woman waiting and more like someone braced for whatever the valley meant to send. Night fell. The wolf calls edged closer, then drifted away. The giant returned in silence, snow packed in his hair and blood dark on his knuckles. He washed them clean in a basin while she heated stew. When they sat to eat, they did not speak of fear. They spoke of the fence line, of the spring where wild mint grew, of the idle gear in the shed that could be mended when the thaw came. They spoke of the boy and the trapper, and whether the ox's hoof needed trimming. Ordinary talk piled like kindling for a fire that had not yet been lit. A new sound rolled up the road then, not wolves, not wind. Low, steady, too regular to be chance. The giant stood and set his bowl aside. The widow felt her throat go dry. She reached for the lantern and shaded it with her palm. The sound drew nearer until the bells on the wire trembled and sang once, a thin, bright warning in the winter air. The giant looked at the door, then at the loose floorboard, then at the window that faced the bend. He did not touch her. He only nodded as if to say the choice she had been weighing had chosen both of them. Hoofbeats stopped outside the fence. A voice called a greeting that sounded friendly until the echo died and left a chill behind. Another voice laughed, a short, mean sound. Snow slid off the eaves with a soft thud. The ox shifted in the barn, and the bells went quiet. The widow drew a breath that hurt her ribs. The giant moved to the shadows by the window with the stillness of an old tree. Through the glass he could see dark shapes waiting. Men with hats low and shoulders hunched against the cold, hands hidden in coats where the iron lay. The riders did not dismount. They watched the cabin like a pack watching a deer hold its ground. The voice called again, asking for a talk about the winter clause and the mercy of quick settlement. The giant did not answer. The widow did not answer. The wind did, lifting a curl of snow from the fence rail and carrying it toward the men like a small white ghost. One rider spat and nudged his horse closer. The sheriff was not with them. The giant's hand found the knife pouch. A dull glow from the lantern traced the old scars along his wrist. He looked back at the widow, and his eyes asked a final question, not for permission but for agreement. She lifted her chin the way she had seen him do and gave a single nod. Beyond the fence, a match flared in a cupped palm, and orange light licked at the end of a twist of cloth. The rider lifted it toward the snow-dry hay stacked at the edge of the yard. The bells sang once more, bright as ice. The giant stepped forward, the floor solid under his feet, and the winter night leaned in to watch what would happen next. The match flickered in the rider's hand, its orange light trembling against the white snow. The widow gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned pale. The giant did not move at first, only watching through the narrow slit of the shutter. His body was still, but the air around him seemed to thrum with something coiled and waiting. Outside, the men shifted uneasily in their saddles, snow crunching under hooves. The silence between them, broken only by the hiss of the wind. The rider holding the torch leaned closer to the haystack. The widow felt her chest tighten. One flame in the barn would catch, then the ox, then the yard, and the cabin itself would stand helpless in the blaze. She thought of the years her husband had spent building the place. The logs cut by hand, the stones hauled from the creek, the seasons of sweat poured into this soil. All of it could vanish in moments. She swallowed her fear, but her body trembled as though the fire was already inside her. The giant finally moved. He stepped back from the window, his face shadowed, and walked to the door with the quiet tread of a hunter. He did not speak. He did not look back. The widow wanted to call out, to stop him, but the sound caught in her throat. He pulled the latch slowly, opened the door, and stepped into the night. The wind rushed in behind him, carrying the smell of horses, sweat, and smoke. His frame filled the doorway for an instant, then he was gone into the storm-dark yard. The riders drew still when they saw him. The torch raised high, casting his figure in a flicker of gold. Snow dusted his shoulders, his hair streaming white in the wind. He looked less like a man and more like something carved from the mountain itself, risen to block their path. The horses stamped nervously, and one rider muttered low under his breath. The torchbearer held his ground, though his smile had grown thinner. The giant's voice cut through the storm, low but carrying. He told them the land was not theirs to take, that the woman owed them nothing that the earth itself would grant. His words carried no shout, but they struck like hammer blows against the silence. The riders exchanged glances. One laughed again, louder this time, to cover his unease. He said the company had papers, had rights, had law on their side. He said the widow had no man, no claim worth a dime, no way to stand against them. He waved the torch toward the hay, daring the giant to stop him. The widow's hands shook as she pressed against the window, heart racing. She could not hear every word, but she felt the weight of the standoff in her bones. The giant took one step closer. The snow cracked under his boots, a sound that carried across the yard. His hand rested on the knife at his belt, but he did not draw it. The torch wavered, the rider's hand unsteady now, though his grin remained fixed. Behind him, one of the others shifted his coat. the glint of iron showing in the far glint. Then a voice rose, clear and steady, from the cabin. The widow had thrown the shutter wide and called out, her words sharp as ice. She told them to leave her land, to take their threats back to the town and their company men. She said the debt was between her and the Lord, and no paper carried by riders would decide her life. Her voice did not shake, though her whole body was trembling. The torchbearer sneered and lifted the flame higher. He told her the Lord would not come down to put out the fire. The giant took another step forward, close enough now that the horses snorted and pulled back. The moment hung tight as a bowstring. The widow could feel it stretching, thinner and thinner, ready to snap. Her breath came shallow, each second a weight pressing on her chest. The giant's hand hovered near the torch, his eyes locked on the rider's face. Snow whipped across the yard, sparks from the flame carried upward into the night. The other riders shifted again, their hands resting near pistols. The tension growing sharper than the wind, and then, from the ridge above, came the long, mournful cry of a wolf. It carried down into the valley, wild and haunting, the sound of hunger and warning. The horses reared slightly, their fear breaking the riders' steady fronts. The torch wavered again, snow hissing as a drop of pitch fell into the drift. The widow's pulse thudded in her ears. She knew one wrong move, one slip of flame, and all would be lost. Yet she also knew something else, that the giant had not yet shown the full measure of the strength inside him. The torch dropped lower, closer to the hay. The giant's hand moved at last, swift and sure, seizing the burning stick before it could touch the dry pile. The rider let out a startled curse as the flame was crushed into the snow with one powerful shove. Sparks burst, then vanished into the white. Silence fell, heavier than before. The riders stared, caught between fear and fury, their breath steaming in the dark. The giant straightened slowly, the charred end of the torch still in his hand, smoke curling from it. His eyes burned, not with anger, but with a steadiness that made the widow's heart. Lurch, the man who had laughed, fell quiet now, his hand tight on his pistol grip but not yet drawing. Another muttered about coming back with more men, with lawmen, with fire and paper and all the power the company could summon. The torchbearer spat into the snow and jerked his reins, pulling his horse back. The others followed, though their eyes stayed fixed on the cabin as they turned. Their threats hung in the air long after their shapes melted into the storm. The giant stood alone in the yard, shoulders broad against the night, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did he turn and walk back toward the cabin, his steps steady, his breath rising like smoke. The widow opened the door, her body still trembling, her eyes fixed on him, as though he were both her salvation and her doom. He set the blackened torch stump against the wall and closed the latch behind him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked, the storm moaned, and the weight of what had nearly been hung thick in the room. At last she whispered that they would return, stronger, more determined, and that next time the fire would not be so easily stopped. He nodded once, his face unreadable, his silence heavier than any promise. She wanted to ask him what he would do when the company sent men not just to frighten, but to claim. When the sheriff came with papers and guns at his back, but the words caught in her throat. Some part of her feared the answer, feared it would be too much blood, too much shadow, too much for her small cabin to carry. The days that followed were sharp with tension. Tracks appeared near the creek again, circling the barn, vanishing into the woods. The boy from the ridge returned, whispering that talk in town had turned ugly, that the widow's name was on the lips of men with cold eyes and sharp hands. The churchwoman came once more, pressing flour into the widow's palm with a look of pity, telling her that stubbornness could cost more than land, that fire was harder to rebuild from than debt. The sheriff stopped by too, his words calm, but the set of his jaw spoke of storms he could not or would not stop. The giant worked without pause, mending the fence, shoring the roof, cutting more wood than the cabin could ever burn in one winter. His eyes scanned the ridges often, his ears pricked for every sound the wind carried. At night he stood watch by the window, shadow looming across the floor while the widow lay awake listening to the beat of her own heart. She began to wonder if his vow at her doorstep had been more than words, if he had tied his spirit to her survival in a way that left no road for him but hers. The valley grew restless. The wolves cried more often, their hunger sharp. Smoke from distant chimneys seemed thicker, rising like warnings against the gray sky. In the town, men gathered at the mercantile, their voices low, their eyes quick when strangers entered. Rumors spread like fire in dry grass. The widow's land was cursed. The giant was a ghost. The company was finished waiting. Each story wove tighter around her cabin, binding it in a net of tension that could snap at any moment. One evening, as the sun bled red across the snow, the widow stepped outside to gather kindling. The giant was already there, standing at the fence line, staring toward the bend in the road. She followed his gaze and saw smoke rising, not from the town, but from the direction of the creek. Her breath caught. The wind carried the faint sound of voices, harsh and sharp, mingling with the low whine of saws and the crack of axes. The company men were not waiting anymore. They were cutting, burning, claiming. The giant's hands tightened on the fence rail until the wood creaked. He turned to her then, his eyes filled with a storm she had never seen before, a fury as old as the hills. For the first time, she felt the full force of the giant. Not just the man who split wood and mended hinges, but the warrior who had walked out of fire and hunger, carrying ghosts on his back. The world seemed to narrow around them, the cabin, the yard, the snow, and the rising smoke all closing into a single point. The widow's pulse thundered in her ears, her breath sharp against the cold air. She knew the moment was coming, the moment that would decide everything in the land. The cabin, her life, and perhaps his as well. The ground itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what storm would break next. Smoke curled into the evening sky from the bend of the creek, and the widow felt her knees weaken beneath her. She clutched the fence rail as the sound of axes and rough laughter carried on the wind. The company men were tearing at the land, marking their claim with fire and steel. For weeks the threat had hung heavy like snow on branches. But now it had fallen, and the valley itself trembled under its weight. She turned toward the giant, and for a moment she thought he might break the fence in his grip, the wood groaning against his hands. His face was not wild, not careless, but steady as stone, yet the fury in his eyes told her he had decided. He would not let this stand. The widow's fear grew sharper. She knew the company would not stop at words. They would send riders with torches, men with rifles, and papers signed in ink that townsfolk would call law. And if the giant answered with steel, the land would be soaked in more than just melted snow. Her heart raced as she tried to think of another way. But she knew him well enough now to understand that his path had always been one of action. Survival was not won by folding hands. It was taken by standing when the world tried to bend you down. That night, he prepared quietly, checking the knife, filling a leather pouch with dried meat, wrapping cloth around his wrists, as if bracing them for what lay ahead. She tried to ask him what he meant to do, but his silence was enough of an answer. He meant to confront them. She felt the ache of fear twist inside her chest. She had seen men leave for war before, but the look in his eyes was different. This was not a march to glory. This was the walk of someone who had already made peace with the price he might pay. Before he left, he paused by the hearth, where the boy from the ridge sat with stew in his hands. The giant placed a broad hand on the boy's shoulder and spoke low, telling him to keep watch over the widow if he did not return by dawn. The boy's eyes went wide, but he nodded, straightening under the weight of the task. The widow's throat tightened. She wanted to call the giant back, to keep him inside, but her words would not rise. She only stepped closer and laid her hand on his arm. For the first time since he had appeared at her doorstep, he allowed himself a faint smile, small and weary, but real. Then he stepped into the night. The hours stretched long, each one a stone added to her chest. The boy dozed by the fire, but the widow remained by the window, watching the ridge for any sign of smoke or flame. The wolves called from the high country, their cries rolling across the valley like warnings. She whispered prayers into the dark, her breath fogging against the glass. At last, just before dawn, she saw him returning. His figure loomed against the pale snow, shoulders broad, hair loose and silver in the faint light. He walked slow, steady, carrying no torch, no rifle, only the same knife at his belt. When he stepped into the cabin, the boy stirred awake, and the widow's heart leapt at the sight of him whole. He spoke little of what had happened at the creek. His words were clipped, shaped by weariness. He said the men had been warned, that their fire was stamped out before it spread, that their axes lay broken in the snow. He said they would think twice before returning. But she saw more than his words told. His knuckles were raw again, and a shadow lingered in his eyes, a reminder that such warnings did not come without cost. Still, for that morning at least, the valley was quiet, and the smoke no longer rose from the bend. Days turned into weeks, and winter began to ease its grip. The snow thinned, the river cracked open at the edges, and the fields showed the promise of thaw. The riders did not return, though rumors drifted from town that the company had turned its eye elsewhere, toward land easier to claim. The sheriff came once more, this time alone, his hat low, his face tired. He said little, only warned that trouble had not vanished, only shifted. Then he left without asking for the deed. The churchwoman visited again too, her eyes sharp. But when she saw the boy helping mend the fence and the giant carrying stones to shore up the barn, she said nothing of judgment. She only pressed a loaf of bread into the widow's hands and left with her lips pressed thin. The valley itself seemed to accept the change. The wolves moved back to the ridges, the ox grew stronger with spring grass, and the boy, once hollow-eyed, began to laugh again while running errands between the cabin and the creek. The widow found herself no longer listening for hoofbeats at every gust of wind. Her nights grew calmer, her breaths less sharp. Yet she knew none of it would have been so without the giant. He had carried the weight of danger on his shoulders, stood like a wall when fire threatened, and in doing so, he had given her back something she thought she had lost forever: safety and a chance at peace. One evening, as the sun set warm and gold across the valley, she stepped outside to where the giant was stacking the last of the winter wood. She told him he had kept his vow. He had worked for her, guarded her, and stood against the shadows that had tried to claim her land. He looked at her quietly, his face unreadable, then lowered his head in a slow nod. For a moment she thought he might take his leave, wander on as he had before. But instead he picked up another log and set it gently in place. She understood then that his choice had already been made. He was not a guest. He was part of the land now, part of her life, part of what would grow when spring came. The boy stayed too. Running between chores, eager to prove his worth, the widow found comfort in the rhythm of it, all the three of them working the soil, tending the animals, mending what the winter had broken. It was not the same as the life she had known with her husband, but it was not a hollow one either. It was new, built on strength and trust, and a strange kind of bond that had been forged in fire and fear, but endured into. Calm. The valley still held whispers of danger, but the cabin no longer seemed so small against them. It stood firm at the edge of the woods, its smoke rising steady into the sky. The widow felt her heart settle into a rhythm she had not thought possible again. She knew grief would always linger, that the past could not be erased. But she also knew the future was no longer empty. The giant had brought with him not just strength, but a promise of life continuing, of roots deepening, of hope rising from the snow. And so, when the last frost melted and the first shoots of green broke through the earth, the widow stood on her porch watching the giant and the boy working side by side in the field. The air smelled of thaw and soil, of beginnings. She lifted her face to the sun, letting its warmth touch her skin. The storm had passed, and though others might come, she no longer felt alone in facing them. The old giant Apache had begged for a place by her fire, and in giving it, she had found more than a worker. More than a protector? She had found a companion to share the silence, a hand to steady the weight of living, strength that did not vanish when the night grew dark. The valley would remember the winter when men came with fire and law, and how one widow's cabin stood against them. But for her, the memory would be simpler, softer. It would be of the man who knelt in the snow and vowed to stay, and how, in keeping that vow, he gave her life back its light. The creek ran clear. The wolves moved higher, and the cabin door stood open to the spring. Inside, the hearth glowed not with desperation, but with the steady warmth of home. And though the world beyond the ridge might still hunger for land and power, the valley itself held its peace for now. The widow, the boy, and the giant worked and rested together, their lives stitched into the soil like roots that would not be torn. The land endured, the cabin endured, and so did they. And in the quiet heart of the valley, where snow once weighed heavy and fire once threatened, the story found its rest.